Welcome to the online A4S Summit 2023. I'm Jessica Friess, A4S's Exec Chair, and I'm delighted that you can be with us today. Over the course of the day, we're going to explore how we accelerate the transition to a sustainable future, exploring some of the latest trends with global leaders from business, finance, the scientific community, and more. We'll be covering a range of different themes, including how we create the kind of tipping points needed in relation to progress towards a nature positive, people positive net zero world, how we finance those solutions, and explore some of the latest innovations in accounting and reporting. We hope that you can take some insights from the sessions today and put them into practice in your day-to-day work. We all have a part to play, and it's essential that we do whatever we can. The transition is already underway. Clean energy investment is on course to rise to US dollars 1.7 trillion in 2023, with solar energy set to eclipse oil production for the first time. We're seeing exponential growth in the adoption of electric vehicles, solar panels, heat pumps, and other solutions critical to the transition. There is, however, more we need to do to accelerate progress. An estimated 8.6 trillion US dollars in global climate finance is required annually between 2023 and 2030 to meet climate goals. And as the scientific community has made clear, the majority of the ecosystem services on which business and society depend are in rapid decline. So we also need to do more to restore nature. The solutions exist, but we need to work together to implement them and double down on some of the actions that are already being taken. During this first session, I'm going to be looking forward to exploring how we create the kind of tipping points that we need to enable that positive shift towards a sustainable future. And first off, I'm really pleased to welcome Emma Howard-Boyd.
Hi, Emma. It's fantastic to have you with us for this opening session of the A4S Summit. To introduce everyone to you, for anyone who doesn't already know you, Emma Howard-Boyd is chair of the Green Finance Institute. She was formerly chair of the Environment Agency in the UK and ex officio board member of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And she's currently chairing a review for the Mayor of London on the city's resilience in the face of climate change. She's also a global ambassador for the Race to Zero and Race to Resilience for COP26, 27, and as we head into COP28. And she was also the UK Commissioner to the Global Commission on Adaptation. And has been involved in A4S's work for many years, currently a member of our advisory council, formerly on the board and co-chair of our Asset Owners Network. Now, Emma, that's a long introduction, but one that misses out many of the leading work that you've done. So really delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
What I'd like to kick off with is, we touched on COP28 in the introduction, and COP28 kicks off later this week. Can you share a sense of the scale of the challenge that we're facing, both in terms of tackling the climate crisis, but also the nature crisis? What kind of trends are we seeing?
It's such a big question that you're starting off with, Jessica, and I guess because much of my time and mind right now is occupied with the review I am doing on London and how ready London is for climate shocks. I think the trends that come straight to mind are those around the climate events that we have been experiencing in recent years. So just recently, the US government has produced its 5th national climate assessment. And in some of the introductory comments to that, this just gives a snapshot of the scale of what we are dealing with. At the point at which the report was published, so far in 2023, $25 billion events in the US alone. And I don't think any of us can have escaped the scale of climate events, climate shocks that have been taking place almost on a daily basis, whether it's wildfires triggering air quality incidents, droughts, floods, hurricanes. Really, those are the trends that come right to mind, and how we are beginning to understand that our work on net zero, important as it is, important that we keep the pace of our work on net zero going, that we need to be accelerating how much effort we are putting into preparing for climate change, climate impacts that is happening today and not just in the future.
Maybe we could pick up on some of the work that you mentioned you're doing at the moment, which is focused really on tackling exactly some of those kind of challenges, and working with London, obviously a large city, a complex city in terms of how a city like London can get ready for the physical impacts of climate change that we're already starting to experience, but that we know are going to be getting worse as time goes on, even if we take radical action to mitigate climate change and accelerate progress towards net zero now. So what role does resilience play, and can you share a little bit more about the work that you're doing with London to think through how ready the city is?
Well, we will be publishing the review early next year. And I think one of the things that I really want to share is how engaged a whole range of different organisations have been in the review, particularly on the back of the surface water flooding that London experienced in 2021 and continues to experience, but also last year's heat wave, the 2 days of plus 40 degrees centigrade, which had an impact across the whole of the country, but also London in particular. I think in all of our work, it's important to recognise the steps that have already been taken to start addressing whether it's surface water flooding, whether it is heat waves, the amazing Thames Estuary 2100 project that is world leading, thinking about how to protect London over the rest of this century, knowing how much climate change has been locked in. But I think it is also has been commissioned in recognition that the impacts we are seeing today are speeding up. And from what we're seeing elsewhere around the world and in Europe, we need to get ready quicker. And so that the importance of the engagement and how many organisations have wanted to work with us to come up with practical measures that can be, and steps that can be taken. I think the other thing that comes across loud and clear is the need to involve the private sector, and the private sector in new forms of finance. So London has already launched green finance products, particularly a green finance facility in June earlier this year, launched by the Mayor of London. But that was very much at this stage focused on mitigation efforts. We need to understand how we can crowd in funding from the private sector, from the world of finance, but from those relevant business organisations, and then also understand how nature can play a massive role in both helping with our net zero efforts, but also in helping prepare for surface water flooding and shading, other ways of keeping cool in a city like London. Much to learn from other cities around the world, but also important to recognise that wherever you are in the world, more work needs to be done in terms of the adaptation, resilience, the climate security agenda.
Can you say a little bit more about nature and how you see nature playing a role? What kind of areas do you think are the most exciting opportunities to really be investing in nature to help tackle the climate crisis, both in terms of mitigation, but also that important point around adaptation?
I think it's been very exciting to see the focus on both the climate crisis and the nature crisis come together, and see some of the policy developments as well in this space. So great to see the progress of the work, like the task force on nature related disclosure, putting nature firmly on the agenda of corporates and investors, but right down to the delivery at a local scale. Some of the pilots that we have seen both in this country but others around the world that now need to be scaled up. So I'm thinking of some of the collaborations that I was involved with at the Environment Agency with the department, DEFRA, the Department of Environment, but also philanthropists, the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, and innovators in this space, Triodos Bank, looking at how to set up agreements to pay for the services of nature from a flooding perspective. And then moving that work through to programs like the Natural Environment Investment Readiness program at the department, which is helping those able to deliver nature-based solutions at a landscape level build up the business case. And I think this is something that the Green Finance Institute has recognised in its work across all types of different finance, but in particular in the nature space, that we need to build that pipeline of investable projects, but also provide technical assistance to help those who are experts in ecology and land management understand how best to create a business case and secure those agreements, which will create a cash flow which makes the project investable. I think this is where rolling up our sleeves and getting involved in the detail, but also making sure that we're developing projects that can then become investable at scale and be taken elsewhere. That's the sort of work that is vital right now, and where we're seeing things change quite rapidly, and that's where I certainly get some strong encouragement.
Now, one of the things that we hear quite often is people talking about climate first, then nature. And I think that that's probably climate mitigation first, rather than thinking climate mitigation and adaptation. And to a degree, I can understand that perspective, because there's so much that needs to be done to tackle the climate crisis and reduce emissions fast. And if we don't achieve that, then we won't achieve outcomes in terms of adaptation and resilience in nature either. But at the same time, as you've touched on with some of those examples, that can be a bit of a false narrative. So what would your message be to those who are struggling to think across how these different issues might interact and what they can do across the breadth of different outcomes we need to be working towards at the same time?
I think collaboration has to be a key part of this, and I think we all have to recognise that we need to bring in different types of expertise. Having chaired the key environmental regulator for England, it became very clear to me, given my financial background, that we needed environmental regulators working in lockstep with economic regulators, in lockstep with financial regulators. And that's just one area where we need that collaboration. It's the same with financial expertise and environmental expertise. I think what has become clearer and clearer to me, and I've been saying this for a while, is that unless we are thinking about adaptation and resilience, climate security in our investments today, given how much climate change is locked into the system, if we're not doing that right now, particularly for those long-term investments, for those infrastructure built environment investments that we are making, we are putting those investments at risk, literally, that they may be melting in extreme heat or washing away in floods. And then recognizing how dependent we are on the natural environment, both in protecting it, restoring it, but the way nature can help with both holding carbon and holding back the worst effects of the weather impacts that we're seeing today. So I think it's thinking in systems and thinking beyond the small solutions that, am I protecting my asset to climate change? But am I thinking about, if I make this asset incredibly flood-proof, will anyone be able to get to it or get away from it? We've got to think more broadly about how we're working in our communities, in our places, and it's complicated, but it's something we've got to start doing at pace.
And if there are sort of one or two key takeaways or sort of steps that you think people who are watching today could be taking, what are those areas that you would encourage people to be thinking about?
I think a key thing is not to think you need to know all the solutions yourself, but who you need to bring in really early to help shape that thinking. Easier said than done. We're all wanting to work at pace. We're all time poor. But I think the more we are working collaboratively from an early stage, the more we are going to come up with those brave and courageous new ways of working. We're dealing with such a massive issue. It needs new ways of doing things. And I think we need to get to that position of working out who we need to have round the table to deliver that change, but also work at pace. So we're not going to get everything right the first time, but as long as we know that we have moments to adjust, we've got to get to that delivery stage. And I think this will require new forms of leadership, new ways of working together, but that combination of collaboration and radical collaboration and working at pace to timelines as much as possible is the way we have to progress in this decade in particular.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Emma. We're just starting out on developing our 2030 strategy, and that's certainly the mindset that we're going in. So an open invitation to people to collaborate with us as well. I think we need to move forward at pace and at scale, and the only way we'll do that is together. So thank you very much for joining us today and helping us to open up the discussion during today's summit.
Thank you.
Next up, I am going to be joined by Professor Tim Flannery. Tim is one of Australia's leading writers on climate change and has spent the last 20 years focusing on biodiversity protection in Melanesia, with a particular focus on community-level action. He is an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer, and conservationist, and was named Australian of the Year. His recent documentary, Climate Changers, follows his search for leadership on climate change. And he is currently professor at University of Melbourne's Sustainable Society Institute.
Tim, it's fantastic to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Well, look, it's a great pleasure, and particularly to be joining you at a time like this. I think many people feel that with the progress we've made at the various COPs and in terms of addressing sustainability, that we've got the job done. And there's a bit of a sense that we might be relaxing into a bit of a slide down towards that sustainability we need. But look, the truth is very different. I think we're just entering the phase of really hard work. We've gained the agreement, but now we're actually we're working at implementation, and that is always far more difficult. As difficult as kind of agreement is, it's far more difficult than reaching the political agreement. And that's because it's dealing with a whole lot of particulars, with communities, with specific businesses, with technologies, with accountability, in a real way where the rubber has to hit the road. And I do feel that the finance and accountability sector and accounting sector have a huge amount to offer in terms of getting us over this difficult period. I've been involved in rainforest conservation, just to give you an example from my life, for the past 25 odd years. And I'm continually astonished at the lack of what I would say banking or financial or accountability skills that many businesses bring to investments in carbon that they wouldn't do in their own business model. I mean, we're used to banks looking into our financial position and working out whether we actually own the properties we claim we own and all that sort of stuff. When it comes to investments in carbon and biodiversity, it seems to me that quite often that rigor is lacking. And this is exactly what we do need. We need the rigor to say, well, is this group of people that we're dealing with, are they actually the owners of the asset of the forests? What is the legal tenure on those forests? We often deal with government and fail to recognise that in fact the ownership lays with community, or that there's at least, very least, a conflict about ownership. And this is one reason why we continue failing. There's a lot of money waiting out there to invest in biodiversity protection, particularly rainforest protection, because we all realise how important it is. And yet the money is not yet being unlocked at the scale required because of those problems, those accountability problems. So I think bringing the rigor to that is hugely important. That will mean, of course, challenging some government ideology, some thoughts about what government thinks it's doing. It also will mean strengthening the voice of communities, for example, by setting up community conservation alliances or associations, valid under the law, with a proper structure, board management structure, with a proper audit trail, and with appropriate community engagement. Those sort of entities that have that are vanishingly rare, unfortunately. Once you do have them, though, you can invest direct into those structures because you can have faith that, in fact, they are fully accountable and that you're dealing with the actual owners of the asset. So there's so much to do. I think and it's such a huge and diverse topic, Jessica, that perhaps I'll just leave my introductory remarks there, and perhaps we could have a bit of a discussion around some of the points that you think are important.
Yeah, and maybe starting with that last comment there. I mean, can you just set out a sense of the scale of the challenge that we are facing? I mean, we're heading into COP28 this week, as you mentioned. We've, as the number suggests, there's been quite a lot of COPs already, some really important progress. But when you look at the trends, the scale of the challenge that we still face seems, is immense. So maybe you could just set out briefly just what that scale is.
Yeah, sure. Look, the easiest way to do that is through the climate lens, as you mentioned. I was involved pretty deeply in COP15 in Copenhagen. So this was 15 years into the negotiating process. We felt we had a good chance there to forge an agreement. Tragically, that opportunity eluded us. But if we had come to agreement at COP15, we'd now be on a relatively easy glide path towards 1.5 degrees of warming at maximum. We failed at that, and over the 13 years since then, humanity's probably produced over 20% of all of the carbon emissions that we have ever produced in our tenure on this planet. So we have added enormously to the problem. Rather than solving it, we've been adding to it. And we are now at a point where the science is becoming quite dire. You hear the alarm bells ringing for virtually everyone in the climate sector, saying we're at the emergency point. We now need to cut hard and fast, which we wouldn't have had to do had we started earlier. And of course, that truth will continue growing. The longer we leave it, the harder the job gets. So this is the time now for implementation. We've had our agreement at COP21. We're facing a very, very tough future if we don't start reining in emissions right now at this coming COP and start learning how to do it effectively. Of course, there's going to be lots of dead ends. Of course, there'll be failures. There'll be opportunities that'll be missed. But overall, we need to make sure we start reducing those emissions now in order to have a chance at staying below 2 degrees by the end of this century.
And where you touch on some of the potential solutions or opportunities, what kind of things really gives you that hope for the future? Where do you think the biggest opportunities are?
Wow. Well, look, the great opportunities are really around, I think, the deployment of clean energy technologies. We know how to do that now. Some countries like Australia are well embarked upon that transition. Of course, what that means if we need to do that is that we've got to engage with community in places like India, Indonesia, Sub-Saharan Africa. You only get those large infrastructure projects in place if you engage, or smoothly at least, if you engage with community, give them a stake in this development. So huge opportunity, but also a difficult road ahead to build those bridges into community and make sure that we're doing this in the best way we can. The other great opportunity really is in using our natural assets, our forests particularly, to keep carbon out of the atmosphere. And a landmark study was published earlier this year that surprised me because it showed that, in fact, we're drawing down about 2 gigatons of carbon a year just through our current forest protection programs. And the paper made the point, if we can increase that by 50% to 3 gigatons a year, we'll be really contributing to that on track of below 2 degrees of warming. So forest protection. There's absolutely no argument now that we need to protect our remaining forests, particularly our rainforests, but we also need to regrow quite substantial areas. You look at the devastation in the tropics that follows the clearing of rainforest, you see vast areas of unproductive land that's sitting there that for relatively low cost could be reforested to enormous benefit to the world in terms of this carbon issue. So again, we've got to find mechanisms to engage with communities and with governments to make sure that that forest protection and reforestation can go together. And of course, this is a huge political problem because in many developing countries, government is relatively weak and the corporations that want to log the forests are relatively strong. So there is a big job to be done here that involves all of the downstream products. It involves regulation at an international level as well as at a national level, and it involves deep community engagement. But that's what the solution looks like. It looks like all of us getting together to make sure that we have all the tools we need to deal with this effectively.
And one of the things I know that you've been looking at recently is sort of what leadership might look like. I mean, some of that I think needs to come from that community level. So really some of that bottom up leadership, but we need leadership at kind of all levels within society. Can you say a bit more about some of the insights that you've come through there and you know, what kind of leadership would you like to see from everyone watching today?
Well, look, leadership is really the key missing ingredient. And I became so concerned about this that at COP26 in Glasgow, I made a documentary about leadership. What does it look like? Where does it come from? And how does it operate? And I took a very broad view of that leadership issue. I went out to the Pacific Islands to interview leaders that I know are highly effective there, to talk to them about their style and their challenges and how they get things done. We interviewed Al Gore. We went to various community leaders. And what I learned through that process was really that the one thing that unites all of those leaders is that they've realized at some point that they really do stand in danger of losing something very precious. So it's not just an intellectual thing for them. They understand in their heart that unless they act, we could slip into a very chaotic and dismal future. And that energizes people, whether you're just someone who's looking after their home and family in a rural Australian town, or you're Al Gore, it doesn't matter, you know. But the one thing that the really effective leaders have, so realize that, but then to be effective, is a genuinely open and transparent and consultative and listening style. The great leaders are people that others want to follow. So they're not those who stand up and trump their virtues as we have at election time in the West. They're those who have a natural constituency of people who see that their interests are reflected in the way that leader works and what they do and the way they live. So their integrity, of course, is a very, very key thing in that. Their transparency, their integrity, their consultation, and their hard work. And in the documentary we made, we looked at leaders from people like Joe Dodds, who's the founder of Bushfires for Climate Action here in Australia, a very effective not-for-profit entity, right through to Al Gore. And you see that is the case all the way through. So I would just say to anyone out there who is concerned about this issue, have a look at the movie maybe, but if you don't get a chance to do that, at least think through how you can be an effective leader every day in your community, in your family, wherever it is, because you will inspire others if you can do that.
And so certainly one thing that from an A4S perspective we've looked at is, how we can help to support creating that kind of leadership, but also how do we get to the kind of tipping points that we need to reach, to positive tipping points, as opposed to some of the negative tipping points that we're at risk of triggering. So I mean, I don't know if you've got any thoughts around that, of how do we create the kind of positive tipping points that might really accelerate tackling both climate change and indeed biodiversity loss.
Yeah. Look, whenever I speak to people about this issue, I say, use your sharpest tool. So your sharpest tool is accounting and responsibility and making sure that the figures are correct. And that is such a powerful tool. As I said at the start of my talk, if we could bring that rigor to everything we do, we would be so much better off. And yet somehow we seem not to do it. So I think forcing through that accountability and saying no, this is not good enough. The sort of figures that are being produced here or the approach here is not good enough. And that takes a fair bit of bravery, particularly if you're a consultant, to do that. But we need to make sure that transparency is there in what we do, how we invest, what our, do our statements, our aspirations match up to the reality on the ground. That's all of the stuff that you can do from a financial perspective. So I would just say, do your job earnestly, whether, it's the same issue, whether you're buying an asset or you're trying to help the planet. We need the same rigor. And you have that rigor, which is a great gift.
And I think one of the areas that you were touching on earlier in terms of looking at the whole offset market, which is partly where some of that is going, in terms of how do you create a market that protects some of these natural assets and recognizes the value and the services that they're providing to us through drawdown. Have you seen any good examples of where you think that is functioning effectively and is, as you say, taking some of the community perspectives and into account?
Look, I have seen some good examples. I've seen many other appalling examples. And I think the way we in the West have to see this is that we desire the protection of biodiversity. We are not the owners of that biodiversity. We're not the custodians of it in a sense that the local community, say in Papua New Guinea, may be. But what that community in Papua New Guinea wants is development and sustainable development. So we're really brokering a deal with that community. Will you protect this biodiversity, which is a long-term prospect, in exchange for these benefits? And the benefits have to be real. You can imagine how badly this could go wrong, Jessica, if you just think about someone coming in with a fistful of money, going into a local village saying, oh, are you the chief? Oh, yes, you're the chief. Well, let's buy your biodiversity protection. Here's $1,000, biodiversity protected, and you go away. And of course it's not, because that person may not be the chief. They may not, or they will not have consulted the community. There's no accountability, there's no trust, there's no long-term engagement. So where this works best is where the really hard work has been done to establish trust and transparency. And I've been involved in Melanesia with setting up some groups where we have done that, where we've registered under the law an association with a proper board of management, which includes some external people, which has a consultative process that includes an AGM that has equal gender balance, where all of the areas to be protected have been GPSed. We know exactly where they are. We have a long-term view, and it's almost daily engagement really with a community like that. And to make sure that any assets that go into the community are also equally shared, so everyone benefits. It's only under those circumstances that you'll start making real progress. Any attempts to make shortcuts and deal through government or anything else is likely to work out less optimally. So I would say, you know, that it's all of that. It's also looking at the problem through someone else's eyes. We have to somehow be able to empathize with those people in that village and understand that, you know, that tree kangaroo, for example, that we're trying to preserve in Papua New Guinea is profoundly important to that community. You know, there was one example I could talk about called the Tankalay Conservation Association, where the tree kangaroo, the Tankalay, we were trying to preserve as a sort of flag bearer for the forests, was down to less than 100 individuals. And we put out some cameras. We had some young men took cameras up into the forest, and we finally captured some moving images of this tree kangaroo. When it was showed at the AGM for the community, people were in tears. They were so deeply moved because this animal is really in their heart, they genuinely believe it is their ancestor. And to see it prospering was something that meant far more to them than just the financial rewards that they were getting from this association. This was a symbol of a revitalized community that had suffered a lot of shocks through time. So if we can take the time to just try to understand and empathize a bit more with the way other people view the world, we will do much better.
I think it's really interesting to think through how back to some of the people who are you know, the communities that we work with the accountants, actually that a very different type of counting and valuation. I mean, it needs to be something much broader that really does take some of those ideas into account if we're really going to value some of the precious natural assets that we have and that we rely on.
Indeed.
Coming back to some of the solutions, I know one of the things that people are starting to look at, but again, it seems very early days, is that question of drawdown. And you've touched on the role that, of course, planting trees can play in that. And can you say a little bit about some of the other natural solutions or your thoughts on technological solutions? You know, where should people really be investing to scale up in that area? Because to stay within a 1.5 trajectory, we can't just radically reduce, but we know we're going to have to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere.
Look, that is very true. And at the starting point, I suppose, for a discussion around this is the realization that the atmospheric composition, as it was before the Industrial Revolution, was the result of planetary processes and life itself. So it was the balance of carbon through deep geology, right through to the way forests and plants capture carbon in the atmosphere and the way the oceans operate. So, you know, in terms of drawdown, to me, the strongest possibilities are those which somehow either enhance natural processes or at least echo natural processes. So if we think about the enhancing natural processes, forest planting is currently by far the biggest contributor to drawdown among all the things we do. So we need to build on that. But going beyond that, there are real opportunities in the oceans with seaweed farming, in my view, just because seaweed grows so rapidly and can draw down a lot of carbon and sequester it in the deep ocean. So there's a tremendous organisation called Kelp Blue in Namibia, which is doing just this at the moment. I sit on their the philanthropic board, so I should declare that. But they are a very good organisation in terms of looking at how we grow seaweed to create a product, but also draw down carbon. Beyond that, I think one of the most interesting areas that's emerging now is the use of what's called silicate rocks. So these are rocks that are quite common on the planet, particularly in places like Australia and Indonesia. And if you take silicate rocks, particularly very pure ones like olivine, and just say you grind up a kilogram of olivine and spread it on a field or on a beach, in short order, most likely within a few months, that kilogram of olivine will have drawn down 1.5 kilograms of CO2 and combined it in the form of carbonate, where it's then permanently locked up in the rocks. This is, to me, it's a hugely important process and potentially enormously beneficial. The difficulty we face at the moment is that the way we quarry rocks, grind them up and transport them all involves the burning of fossil fuels. So we have to green our economy really before we can take full advantage of this opportunity. But once we can, I think that it'll be a real significant contributor. And in the early trials done on the use of silicate rocks on farmland show that you do get an enhancement of crop yield on the order of 10 to 20% for corn, for example, in the southern US. So, there is hope there. It's very, very early days. I don't think we should be rushing in spending billions on this, but we need to start developing our understanding of these other opportunities and how scalable they are in terms of drawdown. And of course, then there's things like direct air capture and so forth, probably going to be very, very useful in terms of creating sustainable aviation fuels, for example. So there's a range of things we can look at, but that's a broad cross section. Can I just say one more word, Jessica, about the kind of near term? With the exception of reforestation, all of these approaches are going to take some years to get into place. So they're not short-term fixes in that sense. I suspect that within a decade or so, if we are not incredibly lucky or incredibly active at reducing our emissions, we'll start facing real crises where people will demand action. And some of that action may involve geoengineering, and that's another whole approach. The thing about geoengineering, though, that makes it tempting to use is that it's instantly effective because, for example, putting aerosols, sulfur into the stratosphere, we feel those results almost immediately as we do with a volcanic eruption. So they're instantly effective, but they're a band-aid on the problem. And they also, we don't yet have a mature political system where we can make sensible global decisions about such things. So any action to do geoengineering will involve most likely a single country, and it's likely to have global consequences. So you can see how that opens us up to potential conflict. Yeah. So I would like to avoid geoengineering as a solution. I suspect we won't be able to, and I think we need to give some thought to those legal aspects as well as the scientific and technical aspects of using geoengineering, because the situation is now so dire that I think some will be tempted to use it.
And so to your point of the near-term actions, and clearly the essential step is to stop burning carbon, stop putting more into the atmosphere, and really start to radically reduce the amount on an annual basis. Where do you see the biggest, where do you really see the hope that might start to happen? Are there some seeds of hope there that will avoid the need, as you were saying, for geoengineering or some of these more radical and risky actions?
Look, there is hope, and the hope lies in the progress we've made so far. So we in places like Australia, we have now proved we can run an electricity grid using renewables pretty much. There'll be a small component still there of fossil fuels in places like South Australia, but by and large we can do it. We know how to do it. And that knowledge can spread around the world. There are renewable assets almost everywhere that can be used to displace fossil fuels. The growth in electric vehicles is another area that I think should give us great hope. Even though, of course, all of those technological solutions come with their own problems, but that's okay. We've got to be able to deal with that as well. We've got to solve this very big problem first. The thing that concerns me the most is the way that fossil fuel rich nations continue to license the extraction of future fossil fuel assets or reserves. That is unaccountable. It cannot be allowed to go ahead. People must see the evil in that, because that's what it is. It truly is evil. What people are doing as they take or tap into those new fossil fuel reserves is tip us over the edge for the enrichment of a few to the detriment of us all. So that cannot be allowed to go ahead. There is hope, but we need to double down on that.
And so if there were a few key messages that you would want to leave people with, it's the start, COP's going to start later this week. So what would those key messages be?
For me, the key messages are for A4S, for you people, to use your sharpest tool. Make sure we're doing all of this accountably. And for everyone, likewise, whether you're a politician or an industry group or whatever, use your sharpest tool to get where we need to get to. Secondly, engage with community. None of this is going to happen unless we have deep engagement right through community. And that's something governments seem to me to be increasingly less able to do. We don't have the way forward to do that. And I'm not sure whether that's because of the deep ideological divides that are opening up in our society or other causes, but we need to remedy that. And we need to really make sure that when it comes to climate change, if we want a leadership position, we wake up every morning with the same thoughts in our mind that this is important, that we are going to make a difference today. We don't put it off. It's not something we just do during COPs. This is something we live by through our lives as climate leaders. So if we can do that, those three things, I think we've got a far, far better chance of getting to where we need to get to. But it is community, it's our conscience, and it's our accountability. Those three things together will get us there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Tim. I think that's a great note to leave it on, and a really great message of saying, what can I do today? It sort of breaks it down into something tangible that each of us can really think about and do something with. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Jessica, and good luck to you and A4S.
Thank you.
Our final speaker in this session is John Creyts. John is an internationally recognised leader on global energy issues and climate change, and he is currently CEO of RMI, a non-profit think tank working to scale transformative change in the global energy system to accelerate the transition and secure a clean, prosperous, zero-carbon future.
And if we can dive straight in, I would love to get your perspectives on some of the scale of the challenge that we're facing. So we're heading into COP28 later this week. So what are the key things that you're seeing to just set out for the audience the scale of the challenge?
Yeah, we're at a historic moment, Jessica, right? As we head into COP28, and we need to hold two simultaneous realities. On the one hand, we're seeing the disastrous climate impacts and really suffering devastating losses around the world that are disproportionately affecting those who can least afford it. So we're deep in the climate emergency, and we're really crossing scary planetary boundaries. You know, as is indicated by the UN's Global Stocktake report, the latest nationally determined commitment synthesis report, we're way off track from any attempts to limit to 1.5 degrees Celsius and even 2 degrees Celsius. And we're even seeing some companies roll back their climate plans and double down on fossil fuel production, right? But at the same time, we also know what the solutions are. And we're seeing exponential growth in renewable energy technologies globally in diverse parts of the world. And an exponential pace of change is happening across key sectors like electricity and electric vehicles that can and will continue to transition the global economy. These are driven not by policies, but by markets and economics and businesses and civil society that are outside the international negotiations. The key message that I want to underscore here is it's not too late, but later is too late, right? The climate is near dangerous tipping points, but global markets are reaching positive tipping points as well. And while the former is much more widely broadcast, we think that COP28 is a chance to shift the prevailing narrative more towards the latter.
So I think that point on some of the real positive change and acceleration that we are starting to see is really critical. I think it's we're all very aware of those physical impacts that we're starting to see, that the trends in terms of greenhouse gas emissions are still going in the wrong direction. And as you say, there are signs of stepping back, not just stepping forward. But if we can touch on those three of those really key sectors that are fundamental to the transition, I'd love to get your thoughts on where you see some of the biggest areas of progress happening in each of those three sectors. So really thinking of electricity, buildings and transport. I know RMI has led a huge amount of work in those areas. So could you touch on those three and where you see the really exciting progress happening?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Some of our newest research looks at the implications across these sectors and really tries to track where the change is happening and how quickly it's happening. If we take the electricity sector, for example, solar and wind are already the cheapest form of new energy for 85% of the people in the world, right? And we expect the cost for solar and wind to continue falling if trends continue, right, by another 25 to 50% here by 2030. So even though we're seeing some challenges with wind recently, especially around supply chains and interest rates, we're confident that the annual renewables build out is on track to exceed 1 terawatt, right? 1 terawatt per year by 2030. This at this pace and scale, that means that renewables would overtake fossil fuels in absolute energy production on the global grid, right, within the next 8 years. And the COP28 global target that's being discussed right now of tripling renewable capacity, it's certainly a bold goal, but we see it as definitely within reach. So that's a real sign of hope. When we look at cars, again, just 2 years ago, 1 in 25 cars sold globally was an EV. This year, it's actually 1 in 5 cars. In 2025, based on our analysis, we think it's going to be 1 in 2 cars. And by 2030, we get to a point where 3 in 4 cars globally sold will be an EV, right? And then when you do all the math and you look at the stocks and flows, you get to a point that by 2040, we have dramatically reduced demand for oil in internal combustion engines globally. And it's not just for four-wheelers, right? The same thing is happening with even more compelling economics for 2- and 3-wheelers in Global South, for buses, and increasingly now for urban delivery vehicles. And we're seeing it move into heavy freight. So just fantastic stories there. I think the building sector is much more complicated. But even there, we're seeing early signs of progress. It's a more advanced industry, certainly when we look at the raw numbers today, where globally the electricity share of buildings' final energy consumption is about a third. It's about 35% right now, compared to 23% in industry or 1% right now in transport. But we do have billions of buildings, right, that need to be retrofit or need to be built to net zero. And that is going to take significant changes in construction practices and regulations and all the different elements that guide the industry. But there is, there is significant change underfoot. And one of the positive side effects, maybe the only positive side effect of the horrific war in Ukraine, is the renewed focus on efficiency that's really being led by Europe. Last year, for instance, the European heat pump sales rose by nearly 40%. And even in the US right now, heat pumps, kind of have overtaken gas furnaces last year for replacements. So we see these big shifts. And with a heat pump, you save, 4/5 of the amount of energy, and you allow that energy to be produced by renewables on the grid. So awareness is being stimulated, and the economics are starting to flow even in the building sector. Different sectors, clearly in different stages of the transition. I would note, though, that even where we're seeing promising evidence of this exponential change, right, in areas like solar and wind, and now EVs and even heat pumps, it's we just can't assume that these changes are inevitable. The pace and scale of the change depends on all of us. It depends on the decisions of our leaders. It depends on market forces and stimulation, right? And it's going to require constant innovation in technology and supply chains, in competition and collaboration, right? If we're really going to follow those exponential pathways toward deploying solutions at scale.
And what kind of things are you seeing that are creating maybe some of those positive tipping points that are really accelerating the pace of action, you know, across those three sectors, but particularly when it comes to something like buildings and heatings, where it's, you know, local planning, lots of local individual decisions and household decisions, rather than something like the grid, where it can be a little bit more top down. It's still hard, but a smaller set of actors who need to take those decisions. How do we create a positive tipping point, particularly in some of those areas where it needs individuals to change their decisions?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. This is a tough one, but I do see rays of hope here as well, Jessica. And let me just give you two stories here recently from places that I've been and things that I've seen. I want to take everyone first to India, right outside Mumbai, where RMI has been working alongside Lodha Group, which is one of the biggest high-end developers in Mumbai, right? But they've decided to focus on how do we make accessible, housing for the masses in India. And they've pioneered a new development called Pallava City, which is really meant to be a learning lab and a template for sustainable urbanization in India, right? And in my visit here just a couple months ago, I saw firsthand kind of the third generation already of iteration within what's planned to be 1 million person city, which currently has 170,000 residents living in it. And they're doing just a fantastic job of integrating high-end energy performance with things like passive cooling and sustainable water and land use approaches, while creating a walkable, bikeable, livable city with green space amenities, EV ready charging, community centers that are all passive with courtyards and water features. And they've designed it even for the resiliency, not just for today, but for the monsoons of 2050, right? They're in the third phase of build out, and they've used it as a learning lab where each successive, kind of phase is incorporating new passive features. They're testing a 5-fold more efficient air conditioner, for instance, and they're actively surveying all of their tenants to understand what works for India, in India, can be constructed in India at India costs for low and middle class people, right? And that is huge in a country where the built environment is expected to double by 2040. And it's just staggering for me to see that. I think, so that's on the one end. If we think about new build, on the retrofit side, I was just up in the Northeast of the United States, looking at an old affordable housing complex, 7-story, big brick building, about 200 apartments in it. And the community came together alongside local leaders to adopt what the Dutch have been doing for almost a decade now, called the Energy Sprong program, which is really industrialized retrofits, where you, without moving grandma out of the apartment complex, you go ahead and affix super efficient insulation, super efficient windows. You attach mechanical packages like heat pump ducting and connections to solar on the roof. And you do this all externally after having manufactured at scale panels in an offsite factory, right? And everyone was there to showcase the first commercial retrofit of this scale in the United States, where it took, the state energy office, the local contractors innovating, kind of the housing owner for the low income community, et cetera, all being there, have collaborated to create this test bed. And you can easily see how it moves from scale. And while we were there, they actually put one of the panels on, and it took all of about 7 or 8 minutes for them to affix, a 12-foot by 10-foot panel to the side of this building. And you can see how the entire building could be retrofit in the course of a couple of weeks, right? After you do, a few months of prep work to get there. So that gives me hope that there are pathways, again, for the big developments in the global South, from to the areas where we've just got a lot of infrastructure that we need to retrofit, that there are economic pathways in both cases that we can deploy at scale.
Fantastic. I think there's just two really exciting examples to just bring to life some of the innovation that is out there and that we need to all then double down on. You touched on two very different geographies, or three in your examples there. Can you say a little bit more about some of those trends that you're seeing, particularly, in you've worked in China and India, in the US, elsewhere around the world, where are you seeing real progress being made, and what different challenges are you seeing different countries facing?
Yeah, so again, as CEO of RMI, I get the chance to travel around the world here and see different things. And maybe I've talked about buildings. Let me talk about the grid for a moment here, and changes there. And I'm gonna again take us to two very different contexts. And at the small scale, I had the chance to travel to Lagos here earlier this year, to the very edge of the grid, to a community called Mokoloki Town. And I actually met the king of Mokoloki Town, right? We had worked with his community to help build a mini grid there, because they're at the far reaches of the grid, and they really had at best 2 hours of power a day. And we helped them scope a request to local developers for a mini grid there that frankly wasn't much larger than the solar and storage that you'd see on a typical house, certainly smaller than what you'd see on a local library or something like that. And in the process, they went from 2 hours of power a day to lights on through the night. But when I saw the king and his chiefs, I thought I was going to hear a good news story. And what I was confronted with was immediately that the lights were no longer on through the night. In fact, they were turning off at 8 p.m. And when I started hearing, kind of the story around it, it was one of incredible growth, right, within the community, where the community was adding new ice boxes and air conditioners. And there was even an entrepreneur that set up an arc welding shop in this remote village, right, to repair farm equipment. And then the biggest factor that happened was that the town actually swelled from being 200 people to being 400 people, right? And this growth, this amazing, kind of opportunity of having access to power in the first place had completely transformed. And so, when I talked with the king, we were talking about expansion, because just because the sun shines doesn't mean the infrastructure will support, kind of the growing community that he was facing. And so we had to step in and help him scope the next phase of growth and development. And this is a vivid example of really helping a community thrive, right? But I want to note that it was all made possible by private capital, right? That in the end, the community benefits that were achieved were from a local developer supported by a local financer, right? With upfront purchase commitments, making this whole transition happen. And so the centrality of ensuring that we've got the finance available to drive, kind of these types of changes to scale in the global South, hugely important, hugely significant. I want to shift from there to China, right? Which China is really driving the pace and scale of the energy transition here. And I had the chance to travel north of Beijing to Zhangjiakou, which is the city, some of you may remember, it hosted the Winter Olympics here a couple of years ago. We were convening a set of global experts to share best practices on high penetration renewable grids from the United States and European Union and Australia, and of course, China. And we convened in Zhangjiakou because of the innovation that's happened there, right? This is a city of about 2 million people that now runs on 100% renewable power. They have massive solar arrays and wind farms, and they have world-leading advanced transmission technologies that help provide the load balancing and the export ability for clean energy to other parts of the country. It's really an amazing operating model that shows where the world is heading and how we can indeed run these high penetration grids. China is using it certainly as a demonstration to build out their larger renewable grids, but we were using it also as a way for learning to disseminate and ensure that places that are growing incredibly fast, like Australia's grid, which is converting very rapidly, kind of have the tools and abilities to support, again, this high penetration clean energy sources provided with significant amounts of renewables as the core. When we look at how all these technologies add up, by 2030, renewable technology solutions are going to dominate the new sales in electricity, in light transport, and low temperature heat. And these are sectors that make up 70% of fossil fuel demand today. And in the rest of the energy system, the price of renewables will fall to parity with fossil fuels, setting the scene for rapid transition there as well in things like the quote unquote hard to abate, which I would contend are really the possible to abate, right? And that we can move at scale here. It's important at RMI, we often talk about something we term applied hope, that it is, it's not enough for us just to be passively hopeful that things are going to work out. We actually have to will into existence the world that we so desperately want and need. And when we do that together, we actually create a world that's worth being hopeful for in the first place. And this is the moment, right, where we all need to embrace that mantra of applied hope, because we have the tools, we have the momentum, we need to sustain and keep innovating to get all the way to a clean energy economy that's accessible to all.
I think that some of the examples you've given so far really can be that source of hope, but if we don't act on it, and if we don't remain hopeful and focused in our hope, then we really won't get very far. Can you share any other opportunities that you think exist to really address the crisis we face? And I mean, as part of that, we know that we need to not only reach net zero emissions, but we need to be thinking about taking some of the GHG that we put into the atmosphere out of it. So, across the other types of opportunities that exist, can you share your thoughts?
Sure, Jessica. And this is a finance conference, so I'm going to talk about economics for a moment. And the economics tell us right now that it is cheaper to save the planet than to destroy it. And it's not just RMI saying this, it's analysis by the International Energy Agency that has calculated we'd save $12 trillion by following a net zero pathway rather than proceeding with business as usual. But to get to that prize, we need money, and there's no shortage of money right now, but we need to direct it in the right way. And there's specific opportunities with the financial and business community that can help ensure that capital is flowing in the right way. Those include to clarify transition finance and what it means to be climate aligned, to educate board leaders on the financial risks associated not just with climate, but also with the exponential market shifts that I've talked about. It's about building effective blending and portfolio models that leverage public capital, and especially in the global South. And it's about supporting the rapid scale out of ambitious transition plans and data transparency by corporates, financial institutions, and governments, so that every part of the economy can explain how they're shifting to address the climate crisis and then be held accountable, right? At RMI, we've been working with a range of civil society and nonprofit organizations, including A4S, to establish some common guardrails around credible transition finance. And we're launching a global call to action to transition finance later this week ahead of COP28. We think this is a critical opportunity because investments in renewables and low carbon businesses are important, but we need to also finance to support decarbonization in the rest of the global economy as well. The steel producers, the airlines, and yes, even the emissions reductions from oil and gas companies, because the path to net zero isn't one that goes around the high emitting sectors, but really goes right through them. When you implement transition finance in a robust and transparent way, it's an opportunity to deliver significant impact in the climate fight. Now, the other exciting things that I'd want to call out are certainly AI and machine learning that can help drive greater transparency, enhance decision making for climate action. We're at RMI, we're working specifically on climate intelligence to help us manage things like methane, right, which are huge global forcers. You know, on the removal side, we certainly want to focus on nature, right? Land-based ecosystems and oceans. We absolutely need their capacity here for biodiversity, but also for carbon sequestration. And voluntary carbon markets are hugely important in helping ensure that nature is properly priced and incorporated and used as a strategic or incorporated as a strategic lever here for us in our combat of climate change. When I think about carbon dioxide removal and direct air capture, these could be important elements in limited ways. I think we need to recognize that if we overshoot, we do need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere, because a 1.5-degree world is important for us. But these should not be technologies that allow us to continue in business as usual. They're incredibly expensive. And so, continuing to emit today and counting on removal technologies in the future will ultimately be too high a price for us. There are too many economic ways that we can reduce emissions today. And I would just finally note that every 1/10 of a degree matters. And even if we exceed 1.5 degrees in the near term, we shouldn't give up and accept 2 degrees or 3 degrees or 4 degrees as an outcome. The climate news is dire, and it's already worse than climate scientists predicted. And that's why we're at RMI hell-bent on the speed of solutions, not targets, because we need to respond at scale today.
And how important are people as part of that transition? We've talked a little bit, a lot about climate and some of the examples of how it's essential to tackle that to achieve lives and livelihoods into the future. But words like just transition get thrown around quite a lot. So where do you see people fitting into the transition?
Yeah, they have to be at the core. This has to be a people-centered transition. We have to bring everybody in, because if we don't all cross the finish line together in 2050, right, we've all lost. And as I've said, there's huge economic opportunity here. This is an opportunity that can absolutely benefit all. And in fact, when you look at the global South and its accessibility to clean energy, many countries in the global South are superpowers in the next energy economy. And in an economy here focused today on fossils, we have about 10% of the world supplying, 80% of the world with energy. In the future, those numbers exactly flip, right? And that shifting, right, of distribution of resources really offers the opportunity for more participation. If we can solve some of the financial, some of the technology access, some of the capacity building needs, that welcomes more of the global population to participate. We're doing that in some ways right now. Things like the Just Energy Transition Partnerships that are underway are the first sets of really global scale experiments to meet communities and countries where they are and to help them build the tools that are required to choose the energy transition that makes the most sense for each of them, right? And that's important to recognize, that the energy transition will take different flavors in different countries and different communities, and each country and each community should have the right to choose the transition that makes the most sense for them. I think the same principles about inclusion in the energy transition apply to wealthy countries as well. And even if I look at the United States, where I live, we have nearly 37 million American households living with energy insecurity, and about 1/3 of Americans actually live in some form of low income or disadvantaged communities. these communities and the global South communities, these are the ones that are most significantly at risk of being left behind in the energy transition. And so we need to be proactive in support and engagement. We're hugely encouraged by some of the recent policies that have been, kind of highlighted here in the United States. Things like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund have a strong focus on requiring at least 40% of the investment go into low income and disadvantaged communities. And we've been working alongside local financial institutions in order to support their access and ensure that no one is left behind in the transition, and indeed that everyone benefits. We think about that $12 trillion IEA price tag that I put on moving faster. That's really creating climate wealth for everyone, and everyone has a stake and a share in that going forward.
So if there's one final message that you want to leave everyone with, what should that key takeaway be?
I think if you read all the headlines about extreme weather and natural disasters we've been seeing all over the world, and the losses that we're suffering tied to that, and that now the UN telling us that we're way off track to meet climate targets, it's easy for people to assume that it's game over, right? But I would say it's game on. That even as we approach these dangerous tipping points, global markets are reaching positive ones. And that's the intersection, right? That's the intersection where opportunity and necessity meet, and where smart business and finance and civil society leaders need to secure their and our future here going forward, right? So we've really got important work to do right now. And the good news is that we can get there. The tools are in place. It's not an inevitable transition that's going to happen. We've got a lot of work to do. But also we've been making good progress. And that progress is going to lead to global transformation. And I love the Buckminster Fuller quote, "There's nothing in a caterpillar that tells you it's going to be a butterfly." And I think right now we're at that point in the energy transition where, the next energy economy isn't going to be at all like the one that we have today. It's going to be different, and it's going to be better, right? It's going to have those elements of inclusion and equity. It's going to have the ability to free us from the constraints of energy, even as we solve issues of climate, and propel us as a global civilization, as a global community toward, kind of higher order problems and challenges as we free ourselves from the limits of fossil fuels.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, John. I think that's a really inspiring message to leave the conversation this morning on. So
thank you, Jessica. Such a pleasure to be here.
Huge thanks to John, as well as our earlier speakers, Emma and Tim, for sharing some of those insights into the trends that we're seeing and some of the really exciting opportunities that we have to create a sustainable future. We'll be back at 10 o'clock GMT to explore how we finance a sustainable future and explore some of the solutions that are out there. So do come back and watch the next session. I look forward to seeing you then.